everybody, how are you today? I've got a surprise for you. Annie, she's here with me for a few minutes. She won't hang around. She only comes in to see me every now and again. But thought I would introduce you to her. She's a special little girl for me and keeps me a lot of company, gives me a lot of company. Anyway, put her down. And today we're going to get started painting the flowers, and that's exciting. In my last video, I talked about using a value finder, which was this. It doesn't show you color, it only shows you values or contrast. So if you don't have one of these, get one. It's really important and it really helps. Doing a value study is really good too. And I print mine out in black and white, saves me a little bit of time, cheats a little bit, but that's okay. I'm in for speed, but I also want to make sure that I've got my values right. And that's why when I'm painting white flowers, I want to get my background in as quickly as I possibly can. Couldn't decide which side I was on. The sooner I can get my values in, it also gets the white flowers started, even before I've got any paint on them. So that's excellent. And then it also tells me how deep I need to have my shadows on my flowers. So that's what we're going to do today, is get started painting those flowers. And the flowers are really exciting. And so I hope that you will stay with me and give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. Let's get started painting. This leaf here went a little bit darker than what I wanted, so I merely wet it a little bit more, and then using a tissue I just soaked up a little bit. These edges along here were a little bit too dark. I'm going to make this leaf go behind these two leaves. So I do want it dark, and I may end up going a little bit darker, but maybe not as dark as what it was before it dried. And I remember I talked about the water. I have 2 containers of water. One I keep clear. One I use for my dirty brushes. That way I can make sure that my clear water is always clean so that I can have the petals be as white as possible. So I'm going to start painting this next leaf because now all of this is dry. So I'm going to start painting this next leaf in here, which is, this was this leaf. This is this leaf. Excuse me. Yes, that's right. And so this leaf will be next here, and I want it to be above this leaf. So I will paint it just a little bit differently. When I was using the quinacridone magenta, it gave me a little bit darker pink in there than I wanted. So I'm going to switch it up and use Rose Madder, which is also a Daniel Smith brand. Most of my colors are Daniel Smith. So I'm going to just mix up a little bit of Rose Madder. I'll show you how I'm doing it. Put it on here because I'm only going to be using small amounts and thin amounts. There we go. Guess that's better for you. Now you can see how dirty my palette really is. It gets pretty disgusting. Okay, so I'm going to use Antwerp Blue, and I'm going to start putting this in here. I guess I should wet the whole leaf here first. Get a little ahead of myself. Antwerp Blue. And then a little of the Rose Madder. And I'm just going to keep going back and forth between these two. Because I want this back leaf back here, this back petal back here is going to be white with just a tiny bit of shading in there. So the top one still needs to be lighter, but with dark edges. And when I painted my other one, the first one, I don't know about you, but I never can paint the same painting twice the same way. So, which is what I'm doing on this one is slightly different than this one here. I've turned things around a little bit, but I can still pull it off because I know what colors I want to use. I've got my drawing and everything, so I'll still be able to pull it off. It will just be slightly different than this one. And in the back one, I've got white written down here so that I would remember to keep that back one white. I'm going to erase those. And I'm using a kneaded eraser to erase it. It won't damage my paper. It also doesn't leave any of the eraser on your paper. Like if you use a regular eraser, it tends to leave eraser bits on it. And using clean water, I'm just going to go in here and see where these different colors are here. I'm going to kind of do that same thing. And just wet my area. Add a little bit of Antwerp in there. Gives it a little bit of definition. Kind of looks like the flowers dipped there in a little bit, in a little area. Put a little bit of the rose madder in there. I see some yellow around the edges here. I'm just going to take a tiny bit of cadmium yellow and put in some of that edge as well. Just gives it just kind of a spark there. I like that idea. So just dipping a little bit in there. I see I just have a little tiny bit on the tip of my brush. And put it up here along this top edge. Let it move around on its own. One thing I like about cadmium yellow, although it's more of an opaque color rather than translucent, I like the way that it reacts in water, because when you touch it, and I think you may have noticed this when I was doing the background before. Okay, there's blue in there. And watch what happens when I touch this cadmium in here. Watch how it spreads. Look at that. I dream about this stuff at night. When it does that, I know I'm crazy. But I love the way that it reacts on paper with water and other colors. It's just mind-boggling to me. That's why I like painting wet and wet, because I love to see the interaction of those colors in there. Okay, enough of that. Back to this. I think I'll put a little bit of rose madder in there as well. It doesn't take much to make that other leaf come alive. I need to have a little bit of shadow back behind it. From this other flower. I'm not going to do it everywhere. Just a tiny bit in there. Just kind of separates that top flower from the bottom. just a little bit. And then I can go back on this top flower and make those edges just a little bit darker, but I've got to wait until it dries. It's not completely dry yet. So I'm going to do some more on this edge. Antwerp blue. Little rose madder. And if I want to soften those edges, I just add a little bit of water to it. Can draw it out a little bit. Clean my brush and make sure that that's clean and draw out the edges just a little bit. I think I need a little yellow someplace else too. Put some over here on this edge. Just a touch in there. We need some more shadowing in there. Tilt it up and let it run around. Soften the edges a little bit. I still need to leave a lot of my white area in there. That's how our brain will pick up that this is a white flower is from all of the other white that's around it. Okay, I'm going to point out something else to you here. See this edge up here? I want to show you what it's done, what it's done to me. How I put this yellow in here, and see this little bit of white? Well, when I look at it, it looks like that petal then is slightly turned up. So maybe it comes up a little bit and then it goes up and then just slightly curves up that other way. So I really like that look. I think it gives it kind of a unique look to it, but I want to show you something else. So I just stopped recording for a little bit and let some things dry because my lights, as I said before, are very bright in my studio and they tend to make my paintings dry a little bit too much. So now I've got what I didn't want. I've got a bloom over here in this area. Now I don't like blooms because I don't know how to use them properly in my paintings. So now that that's it, well, it's still wet. This is dry. Slightly. I'm dry over here, I'm dry up here in this area, but I'm still a little damp here. So I'm going to leave this alone until this completely dries now. And then I'll go back to it and I'll show you how to remove that bloom. That's a mistake on my part, but you know what? We make mistakes in paintings all the time, and almost always there's a way to correct that. Learning point here for you, how to correct our mistakes. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, I've got some more white petals over here in this area. So I'm going to jump over here to this area, let this other one dry, and come back over here to this. So I'm going to go ahead and wet this area. I'm going to wet it a little more than what I normally do because those lights are so bright and it's warm in my studio. See if I've got any dry spots in there. That's why I lift this up and look at it from an angle so that I can see dry spots in there. Okay. Now I'm going to take a little bit more of the Antwerp blue, and this is what I'm looking at here, is this area over here. So I'm going to add this down over here. It's going to curl out a little bit, but I kind of like that look. It will soften as it dries. Use a little bit more rose madder in there. I think I'll put just a tiny bit of yellow up there in that same area because I can see it here on this petal. And I'm going to overlap it a little bit so it doesn't give me the curled edge like I had over here. This one will go down a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of Antwerp blue in there to mix with that, so it kind of is turning green. And to me that says the green background in this area then is reflecting onto this slightly curved over leaf. I'll add a little bit of phthalo blue-green shade to that. A little bit more yellow. Gives me a nice little green in there. I'm going to come back in while this area here is still damp and shiny and add a little bit more color there. Tilt my board a little bit so I can get it to move around a little bit more because I don't want it to be just a dotted line in there. I add just a drop of water to that area. I'll make it spread just a little bit more. Now I'm going to wipe out a little bit of this area over here. And then soften that line through there. So I've wiped off my brush, it's damp, and soften that line out just a little bit. And I'm going to add a little bit more green over here to this edge, or blue, Antwerp blue over there. Let's make it turn under a little bit more. And soften that. Just dabbing that. We'll give it what because I only want the very edge there. Let it sit there for a minute and think. So while that's happening, I'm going to come down here to this center area and I'm going to put some Van Dyke brown around here. If I look like I'm jumping around, and I am, because as things are wet, if I paint next to where it isn't wet, then I don't have colors that are bleeding into each other. So take a little bit of, just using such a tiny amount of this brown in here. That I didn't even mention that that's what I was going to be using in this. But by putting this along the edge here, it kind of raises it up. And then I'm going to add a little bit of New Gamboge to this outside edge a little bit as well. And then smooth out those edges. Let's see how these are doing. That one's feeling really dry. but my paper is still wet over here in this area. So I'm going to continue on to another petal here. So I think what I'm going to do on this area here is I've lightly drawn in my shadows from my stamens here. So I think I'll paint those in. And by doing that, I'm just going to wet where those shadow lines are. And you can see those in this area here. You can see those there. So I'll just go in and wet this area. And I'm just going to use a little bit of Antwerp blue by itself. But I can just put it in this wet area now and let it, turn it on its side a little bit so that I can see where I've wet it. See, I'm just adding just a little bit of color in here. Then after everything's dry, then I'll go in and erase my pencil lines. And they don't match up exactly to the way I have this drawn here, but that's okay because I can continue to correct that. But you can see how it's forming shadows in there. And I don't want it to be real dark. I want it to be rather light. I'll bring this over here. There's a little bit of shadow in this area. Dried a little bit, so I'll just continue wetting that a little bit more. Adding more Antwerp in there. It doesn't take a lot to put the shading on there. And then I've also got little shading marks along this petal. So I'm just going to put a little bit in there. Just wet those areas a little bit. When you're painting white flowers, it doesn't take much to make the flower come alive. Soften those edges, wiping my brush off a little bit and just softening those edges just a little bit. And like I said, once it's dry, then I'll go back in here and erase my pencil lines so that we don't see those. Turn my board, move my water. Because the way my lights are mounted, I can't move my camera. And this will be, this flower down in here is all behind these flowers. So I'll paint these rather dark over here. So I'll get started with the center area. And like before, I used cadmium yellow for the very center area. Just tiny, tiny dabs of it. Little new gamboge. And because this center area, which is this one down in here, you can see it's much darker. The whole flower is much darker there. So I'll continue making that dark by just adding a little bit at a time and building it up. A little bit of Van Dyke brown around this center edge here to get it started forming. And then I'm going to put in some Antwerp blue over here in this area and get started on this one, on this petal over here. And I didn't wet it, so quickly wet it. I'm tilting it up and looking for the dry spots. If I have dry spots in there, the paint won't go into those dry spots. So that's why I want all of the dry spots gone, not leaving any white area in there. I posted a short video clip from a fabulous artist today by the name of Thomas Schaller. Hope I pronounced his name right. And he was talking about values and shapes. If you go to my Facebook page, Paintings from the Heart by Linda Smith Latimer, you can watch that piece. And I think it is very valuable information on how to get those deeper values in your paintings. I think it's critical that we have those values in our paintings so that we have some life in our paintings. No life, then it looks flat. So when I'm going to be building this one up a little bit more, I want it darker like this other one up here. So I'm going to continue adding some color in there. I'm going to put a little bit of deep turquoise in there. And you start from the bottom, the center of the flower, and let it move out this way. Then as the leaf, the petal, I don't know why I keep saying leaf, as the petal flows or folds out, I don't know whether that's the right term, curls out, it will be lighter on the edges. And if I want to lighten that up even a little bit more, I can use a tissue for those outside edges. Use my brush, dried, and soften those edges. Now I'm going to use a little bit of the Quin Magenta down here in this area because I want towards the center to be darker. because this is wet, I'm just going to bring this line up like this. It's kind of the veins in the flower. And I want this leaf to be underneath this next petal over here. It's going to make this edge over here darker. So that it's kind of hiding underneath that other petal. And I'm going to do it on the other side, over in this area, so that it's hiding underneath that petal as well. Smooth this out a little bit. When I remove my masking fluid, which is this in here, those stamens will be white, and then I can go in and paint them, and they will pop out more. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to do on that one for right now. I'm going to come back up here to this area. And this is dry now, so I'm going to show you how I'm going to get rid of these blooms, because I don't like it in my work. I'm just re-wetting that. Now if it was still wet, this would not work. But because it's dry, I can get it to work. And I've just re-wet my brush and going over those lines, and it softens that area in there. But while I'm at it, and since I'm just using clear water to soften that area, I'm going to wet this entire area around here. I'm going to use a little bit of deep turquoise. Where are my paints? They're drying out again. Deep turquoise. Around these edges again. Those shadows are. A little bit too much water in there. I showed you this technique before. I just take the edge of a tissue and I can just allow it to soak up some of that water, and then I can control it. Or I can take my brush and soak it up. I want this in here to be whiter, so I'm just going to soak that up a little bit. But you can see it's giving it some definition in there of where the shadows are. And on this